In the summer of 1887, the market town of Ellesmere wore its pride on every brick and cobblestone. As banners fluttered above narrow stalls and children chased crying gulls along the riverbank, the Barnes Institute emerged at the town's heart, a grand structure of pale limestone, arched windows of colored glass, and iron railings polished to a dull gleam that caught the morning light. Philanthropist Edmund Barnes, known for his gentle smile and carefully tailored suits, had poured his fortune into the hall meant to cure despair and illuminate minds, his name carved above the entrance like a silent promise. By afternoon, the square filled with townspeople in modest bonnets and rough spun coats, their faces lifted in hopeful curiosity at the sight of that ribbon stretched across the doorway, held taut by the mayor's stiff fingers. A handwritten letter sealed with the royal crest lay in Edmund's hand, inked in the steady penmanship of Queen Victoria herself, praising his devotion to human welfare and urging the Institute to bring light to suffering souls. As the mayor raised his speech from trembling lips, a hush blanketed the plaza, interrupted only by the occasional creak of carriage wheels and the distant toll of Ellesmere Church's oldest bell. Under that hush, few noticed the iron bolt that clicked behind the inner doors, echoing like a heartbeat through corridors still empty of light, or the flicker of candle flame glimpsed through narrow slits in shuttered windows. Edmund's voice, calm and measured, spoke of breakthroughs in medicine, of the shattered mind and fractured heart. And as his words rose into the still air, a cold draft curled around ankles and whispered warnings unheard. Children pressed their cheeks against iron gates, their wide eyes reflecting the stained glass above, while mothers clasped purses and sons tightened gloved hands on wooden canes, all drawn to the Institute's glow of possibility. At dusk, when the sun sank beneath rolling hills and the last ribbon fell to the ground, lantern light spilled from the entrance, revealing silhouettes moving with deliberate steps along marble floors that would soon drink blood. Rumors drifted from hushed lips in taverns and kitchens that the Institute's true work happened after midnight, when pale figures in dark coats escorted reluctant visitors through hidden stairwells to rooms alive with chanting. No town record mentioned those passages, no ledger noted the midnight hours, and yet some swore they heard cries that faded into silence near the laboratories below, where science bowed to something older and more terrible. As lanterns swung over wet pavement, the townspeople turned homeward, shoulders straight with purpose, unaware of the doors closing behind them. Locks engaging without ceremony, sealing secrets in the shadows of stone walls. In that silent hour, Edmund Barnes lingered beneath stained glass, showing an angel with a broken wing, tracing the carved inscription with a fingertip as though greeting an old friend, his gaze soft but hollow. His reflection in the polished brass bell that hung above the entrance showed a man at ease, yet in the glass behind him a second figure stood only in flickering light, watching with eyes that knew too much. By morning the Institute would open to lessons in healing and reason, and the townspeople would praise its promise. But in that fragile moment between night and day, the building breathed like a living thing. Deep beneath the lecture halls, hidden by careful design, narrow tunnels arched into cellars where silence was taught as a lesson of mind, and despair was shaped like sculpture in rooms no map could mark. Those cellars held instruments carved from bone and steel, tools of precision that whispered secrets of ritual as they gleamed under oil lamps, waiting for hands that knew their purpose too well. The Institute's facade gleamed under the rising sun, its windows catching light in patterns that danced on pavements, hiding the darkness behind each radiant pane of glass. And in the watching shapes of stone gargoyles perched above, one might glimpse the shadow of a man who wore civility like a mask, concealing the slow burn of horror in each careful breath. The maid who swept the entry hall felt a chill climb her spine as she passed beneath oil lamps, certain she heard the echo of frantic whispers that no living voice should speak. A country doctor summoned to inspect the opening's decorations noticed symbols scratched faintly into the lintels, marks that matched no alphabet he had ever studied but felt carved into his memory. And in the spaces between day and night, when the town's pulse slowed to the soft rhythm of hearth fires, the Institute exhaled a presence that seemed almost human, as though the stone itself had come alive. No one could imagine the depth of the darkness waiting behind walls. In the hush of midnight, the Barnes Institute's corridors lay bathed in the flicker of candle flames, their light pooling on polished oak floors that gleamed with unsettling clarity. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat through vault-like archways, and the shadows born from wavering flames seemed to lean closer, drawn by something unseen. Night watchman Thomas Greaves inked his journal by the dim glow of a single lamp, his hand trembling as he recorded the impossible. Footsteps that began beside him, sounding solid and deliberate, then vanished into bare stone walls without so much as a hollow thud. At first he blamed drafts or the creak of settling wood, but the cries he heard, low, fractured gasps, shook him to the bone. They came from rooms that should have been empty, where locked doors bore no keyholes and ventilation grates led only to darkness. Thomas wrote of whispered murmurs rising and falling like ragged breaths, voices that spoke words he could almost make out, promises of release, pleas for mercy twisted into chants of something older than mercy itself. Meanwhile, Dr. Henry Hildebrand, once celebrated as a pioneering disciple of antiseptic practice under Joseph Lister, strolled the halls with measured steps and an expression of polite curiosity. His reputation as a modern healer shielded him from suspicion. He regarded rumors of ghostly sounds as the province of gullible minds. Yet the more he walked these halls after dusk, the more he felt his confidence erode. In the lecture theater, he discovered that seats warmed by unseen bodies betrayed recent occupancy, though no student or patient had been admitted since dusk. On the second-floor landing, he found a lone leather glove, its fingers stiff and outstretched as if the wearer had reached for salvation and left behind nothing but cold air. That night, the Institute's hush deepened into oppressive quiet. Lamps dimmed on their own, and the soft hiss of extinguishing flames left pockets of darkness so complete Thomas feared breathing. In his journal, he noted the precise hour, 2:30, when he heard a distant footfall, a single boot scraping gravel as though someone paced beyond a barred window. He crept toward the source, guided only by candlelight that trembled against the walls, and found the corridor's far door ajar, revealing only ink-black void. When he peered inside, the lamp wavered and went out. The door thudded shut behind him, and the corridor fell still. He fumbled for matches, igniting a glow that revealed empty air and a sense of separation so profound he felt as though he hovered apart from himself. Across the hall, a stout night porter named Wilkins vanished. One moment he stood at the nursing wing's entrance, keys jingling at his belt. The next, his lantern lay abandoned on the stone floor, its light guttering. No footprints led away, no hinges bore marks of forced entry, and the corridor beyond remained locked and silent. Thomas found Wilkins's journal on a stool, its final entry scrawled in a trembling hand describing a face from behind the wall, eyes empty sockets of bone. Then the ink ran, as if water had dripped across the page, and the next lines dissolved into smear. Dr. Hildebrand learned of Wilkins's disappearance at dawn, when the library's windows opened to a sky pale and dripping with dew. The porter's quarters were untouched, coat hanging by the door, boots lined beneath the bed, slippers neatly beside them. On the bedside table, Wilkins's spectacles lay beside his half-finished cup of tea. Steam vanished hours ago. A scrap of candle stub lay melted into the saucer, its wax pooling like blood around the rim. A search of the cellars revealed nothing but crates of unused surgical tools and sealed jars of distilled water. Yet in the hush of those damp vaults, echoes answered them, soft scuttling, breathy exhalations that rose and fell in the emptiness, as though Wilkins still wandered the shadows below. As daylight crept through stained glass panes, Hildebrand felt doubt take root, a slow gnawing rot at the core of his faith in reason. The Institute, with all its antiseptic promise, bore secrets woven from fear and silence. Somewhere behind those polished walls, someone, something, was learning how to break a mind quietly, like opening a flower petal from within until it withered. And in the deepest dark beyond the lock of every door, Herbert Mallory watched these disturbances with quiet approval, certain that the Institute's true purpose would be understood only when every cry had faded and every whisper had become part of the stone. Herbert Mallory entered the Barnes Institute lobby each morning with the same deliberate calm that defined his every gesture. His frock coat, pressed so sharply its seams cut the air like a scalpel, and his smile offered reassurance even as it masked a deeper intent. Townspeople and visiting doctors alike praised his warm demeanor and clear explanations of breakthroughs in treating melancholia and hysteria. And when Prince Albert's medical envoy arrived under a cloud of ceremony, Mallory greeted him with steady courtesy, guiding him through lecture halls where chalk sketches of the human mind curled across blackboards like winding rivers. The envoy spoke of Mallory's reputation as a rising star in psychology, entranced by the promise of curing despair through observation and careful intervention. Yet behind the veneer of courteous professionalism, Mallory's true work unfolded in the quiet hours after lectures ended, when he led selected patients through corridors lined with ivory busts of Hippocrates and Galen, their stony eyes bearing silent witness to what came next. In one hidden chamber beyond the library, he had installed a series of arched mirrors and whispered that the reflections could reveal the soul's hidden chambers. As patients peered into glass, he circled them with a stethoscope pressed not to their chests but to their temples, listening for echoes he believed to be murmurs of past transgressions. When he detected a faint tremor in their breathing, He would mark their foreheads with a thin line of crimson pigment made from ground cinnabar, telling them it was a sign of emerging self-awareness. The pigment burned their skin, leaving behind delicate scars that resembled ritual glyphs more than medical markings. Mallory recorded each scar in notebooks bound with goat hide, noting how the pain of marking sharpened his subjects' focus, fracturing their perception of reality until fragmented memories bled into invented nightmares. He spoke to them in tones so gentle that they trusted him even as his experiments edged toward cruelty. In another room outfitted with narrow benches and shallow water basins, he conducted what he called the baptism of reason, filling patients' hands with tepid water laced with laudanum in doses small enough to dull but not to kill. They believed the liquid would cleanse their minds, but under Mallory's direction they repeated phrases drawn from alchemical texts, phrases that twisted simple reflections into incantations. When the water's haze loosened their tongues, he prompted them to describe childhood fears in exacting detail, then shattered their emerging calm by plunging their arms into ice-cold troughs until they gasped for air and their visions swirled into nightmarish shards. He watched their eyes glaze over with the rapture of panic, and he measured the milliseconds between their first tremors of fear and the moment they surrendered to silence. All the while, he maintained an air of tranquil authority, arranging each scene as if directing a play where he alone understood the script. His office walls, lined with leather-bound volumes on phrenology and early experiments in electricity, concealed a small alcove where he kept relics from past patients, a lock of hair singed at the roots, teeth filed into jewel-like points, a fragment of fabric sewn into flesh as part of a somatic memory study. He cataloged these tokens in rows of glass jars, their contents floating in formaldehyde and labeled with dates and coded symbols. Mallory believed that by dissecting fear itself, he could distill human genius from trauma, a theory he shared only with the shadows that pooled in the corners of his sanctum. Outside his door, the Institute's corridors hummed with conversation about his gentle optimism and groundbreaking case studies. And when the envoy sent word to London praising Mallory's balanced approach between science and compassion, the psychologist curated the letter into his personal scrapbook. Yet Mallory's reflections in polished doorknobs never revealed the small, precise scars on his own wrists, scars he traced each dawn with a drop of crimson pigment, as if renewing a covenant with his darker self. No one suspected that the ritual behind his steady composure was what granted him perfect control over those who entered his domain, that each kind word masked a calculation carefully measured in the silence between heartbeats. In the hush before dawn, he closed his eyes and listened to the Institute awaken, the rustle of curtains and the distant drip of water echoing like distant confessions. He smiled, knowing that in time the world would recognize his brilliance and the thin line he walked between healing and horror. And when morning light slipped through colored glass, painting stained shapes across marble floors, he would step into view once more, posture flawless and voice gentle, guarding his secret in the mask of normalcy. A hidden door beneath the chemistry wing leads to a vaulted cellar where Mallory conducts symbolic ceremonies, smearing victims with powdered nightshade in patterns drawn from hermetic texts. Each victim awakens convinced they have lived past lives of suffering, only to vanish days later, leaving behind a single candle stub. Beneath the clamor of the day's experiments, in the hush where cobwebs trembled under lantern glow, Herbert Mallory turned the latch of a door no map recorded and stepped into a vaulted cellar carved from ancient stone, its arches rising like the ribcage of some great beast lying in silent watch. The air lay heavy with damp and dust, and oil lamps affixed to iron rings along the walls cast tall, wavering shadows that danced like whispered phantoms. At the far end, a stone dais stood surrounded by scattered bones bleached by time, each fragment arranged in concentric rings that Mallory had traced in chalk long before any flesh had walked those stairs. He moved with deliberate care, his black frock coat trailing like an eclipse across the floor, and placed his tools on a low slab. Crucibles of powdered nightshade, brushes trimmed from wolf's fur, and slender vials of lavender oil distilled in glass etched with his own initials. With the precision of a painter, he dipped the wolf hair brush into the pale dust and drew sigils upon the dais in designs culled from hermetic manuscripts. A fusion of alchemy and arcane mysticism meant to unlock the boundaries between life and death. Each curve and line held meaning only he understood. The curve of the soul's descent, the circle of suffering reborn, the point of entry for a spirit to return in torment. He beckoned the latest subject forward, a young woman sent by well-meaning patrons believing the institute could cure her sudden melancholy. She stepped with a tremor of hope and fear, her dress gathered at the waist, her cheeks pale under lantern light. Mallory's voice, soft yet unwavering, guided her onto the dais, and he told her to lay flat, eyes closed as he worked. He coated her temples, her collarbone, and the curve of her ribs with the nightshade dust, each smear drawing a pattern that crossed nerves and tingled the skin. The powder bit with a slow fire, and as Mallory painted the final glyph above her heart, he whispered words lifted from a Latin psalter reversed, a litany of remembrance urging the past to breathe anew. Minutes stretched into hours. The dank air weighed on every breath, and the only sound came from the woman's quiet moans as the seed of nightshade's poison crept beneath her skin, coaxing hallucinations from her mind. Mallory watched with fascination the moment her chest rose in a startled gasp, when her eyelids fluttered open and her voice trembled as she spoke of fields soaked in blood and walls lined with gallows. She recounted a life as a peasant burned at the stake during the reign of Queen Mary, felt the heat of flames licking her ankles and the crackle of fire in her ears. For Mallory, these visions were proof that the hermetic patterns had torn a slit between her present and some long-forgotten past. He scribbled furiously in his ledger, noting pulse rate, pupil dilation, and precise phrases she uttered. Phrases he would later compare to entries in county records and ecclesiastical archives. When the fit subsided, Mallory noted the time and retreated to the periphery as the young woman lay curled on the dais, sweat beading on her forehead and tears tracking through Nightshade's crimson hue. He offered her lavender oil to calm her nerves, but she pushed the vial aside, her eyes unfocused and wide, convinced she carried memories that belonged to another century. Over the next days, she roamed corridors with a haunted gait, murmuring prayers in archaic dialects until, on the fifth dawn after the ritual, she stepped into the Institute's vestibule clutching a single candle stub and walked out into the mist without direction or farewell. Staff found only her empty slippers and the stub, its wax stained by the last flecks of nightshade. Mallory inspected the stub by lantern light, turning it in his fingers as though reading a palm. He noted its exact length, the angle of the final burn, and the faint imprint of a Gothic cross pressed into the wax's edge. In his ledger he wrote, "Subject transcended temporal anchors. Stub confirms complete departure." He set the candle stub among others in a carved oak box beneath the dais, row upon row of truncated flames marking each soul he had sent away. Each hint of an afterlife summoned and then sealed. No records existed of where the vanished went, no bones to unearth, no parish ledgers to mark a burial. Instead, silence filled the space, and Mallory believed that in the absence of a corpse lay the triumph of his art. For him, true mastery over the mind required not just the shattering of perception, but its total erasure, the removal of every trace that tethered a person to this world. He believed ritual offered a vessel for transcendence, and by steering that vessel into oblivion, he became both cartographer and executioner of human consciousness. At dawn, he ascended the stone steps, replacing the hidden door as if it had never opened, his boots brushing away stray dust. Above, the chemistry wing buzzed with bland lectures on compounds and experiments on distilled water. And Mallory slipped among colleagues, his coat as spotless as his reputation. To them he spoke of academic pursuits and the promise of future treatments for hysteria, his tone warm and unguarded. No hint of bone and blood stained his words, and no tremor betrayed what he had wrought below. Yet in the quiet corners of the institute, lanterns flickered uncertainly as though reluctant to cast full light on what lay beneath. And in the oak box hidden beneath the dais, the line of candle stubs grew each week, marking the tally of minds undone and bodies erased, each stub a testament to Mallory's conviction that the human soul was a canvas to be rewritten, until the day his ledger itself might vanish, leaving only the ghosts of suffering and a vault sealed behind a door no one dared to find. Mallory's notebooks described the quiet method in which cloaked hoods of moth-wing silk strip away sight and sound, forcing the mind into excruciating isolation. Inspired by Dr. James Paget's work on sensory deprivation, he carves arcane sigils into each hood, believing they chart the soul's hidden chambers. In the dead of night, beneath the antiseptic glow of a single lamp, Herbert Mallory prepared his latest subject for what he called the quiet method, a ceremony he claimed would reveal the raw structure of the human spirit. He stood before a rack of hoods fashioned from the wings of silkworm moths, each fabric paneled with fragments so fine they shimmered like wet skin in the light. And into these panels he had painstakingly carved symbols drawn from grimoires rediscovered in continental monasteries. The sigils twisted in spirals across the silk, resembling no language known but echoing runes of power meant to call the soul into itself. Mallory ran a fingertip over a hood's edge, tracing the pattern of a spiral eye, and inhaled the faint scent of silk warmed by lantern air. Each hood waited like a shrunken cathedral, promising silence deeper than absence, a void in which the mind might echo until it shattered. When his subject, a timid clerk driven to the institute by trembling hands and nightmares of an empty world, was led forward, Mallory ensured the chemistry wing's labor ceased, leaving only the slow drip of distilled water in the pipes and the soft scrape of his own boots. He guided the clerk's head into the hood, adjusting its weight so it pressed gently against the skull, and he fastened a leather strap beneath the chin. At once the world contracted into the hush of darkness, and sound became a stranger. The clerk's breath rose into the silk like a frantic whisper, meeting no reply. He lifted a hand to his face but found only cloth, and his shout died in the cage of his own fear. Mallory stroked the side of the hood, murmuring the words he believed would anchor the process. First release sight, then mute sound, then listen for the dry drumbeat of thought itself. In that void, the clerk's mind scrambled for reference. A fading echo of candlelight, the memory of laughter, a raindrop's tap on window panes. Each memory was siphoned away by the darkness until he grasped only the bare scaffold of his own breath. Mallory recorded in his ledger the precise moment when the first bead of sweat traced a line down the hood's inner silk, noting how long it took before he heard the clerk's heart slow to a single measured throbbing. At 30 minutes, he introduced a low vibration through the straps designed to mimic the tremor of an earthquake, and cataloged the clerk's muted cries by listening with a stethoscope pressed against the hood. He believed the vibrations would coax the soul's hidden chambers into resonance, revealing faults where guilt or desire lay buried. After an hour, the clerk collapsed in a heap when Mallory removed the hood, his eyes blank moons in a pale face, his voice gone. Mallory offered water, but the clerk stared through his trembling hand at the lamp's flame, unmoving. He scribbled in the margin of the notebook. Subject reduced to listening to own breath. Mind fracturing at boundary of silence. Each observation was clinical yet reverent, as though Mallory worshipped the moment the human mind first realized it could vanish. On the third trial, Mallory extended the hood's ritual until the clerk reported hearing footsteps in the corridor outside the cellar, though no one approached. Shadows scraped against stone, though the walls stood empty. He described the faint hum of voices chanting in a language he could not recognize, and began to rock in place as if lulled by the sound. Mallory noted that sensory deprivation had unlocked those voices. Voices he believed to be the echo of past subjects, their despair recorded in the very fabric of the cellar's stone. As the clerk muttered fragments of incantations, Mallory carved a new sigil onto the hood, one that combined the pattern of eclipse with the form of a closed ear, and observed how the clerk's whisper changed tone as though speaking through someone else's tongue. When Mallory finally lifted the hood and placed it back on its rack, the clerk stood rigid, eyes distant and drowned in suffering. He could not speak, yet tears stained his cheeks and his hands shook as though afraid to touch anything that might belong to this world. Mallory gently guided him to a bench and noted his pulse before he left the cellar alone, his departing footstep hollow as a casket lid. The subject vanished the next morning, leaving only the hood behind, its inner lining slick with tears and saliva, the carved sigils etched deeper by the strain of cloth against flesh. Mallory collected the hood and stored it in his personal cabinet alongside others, each sighing silk vessel labeled with a date and a name that no longer existed in Ellesmere. He believed every hood mapped a secret corridor of the mind, a gallery of fear, a garden of memory, a sanctum of guilt. Each subject, stripped of sight and sound, became an unwitting pilgrim through those corridors, and Mallory's hand guided them past closed doors and empty rooms until they confronted the loneliness at the heart of consciousness. In his journals, he wrote that human suffering held an architecture waiting to be surveyed, and that by charting its paths, he could reconstruct the soul in a form of his own design. At dawn, he locked the cellar door and returned to lectures above, speaking of mental health advances with the same calm precision as before. His colleagues noted nothing unusual as he discussed new horizons in psychotherapy, unaware that beneath their feet lay rows of silk hoods and the silent witnesses of broken minds. In the quiet between lectures, Mallory opened his ledger and circled passages in red ink, readying himself for the next trial. For him, the ultimate discovery lay not in curing madness, but in mastering the void within, the stillness that revealed the soul's deepest shape, and in owning that stillness entirely. In a packed lecture hall, Mallory extols the virtues of controlled misery, quoting Francis Galton's theories on inherited genius, while a student vanishes from the front row without applause. The audience leaves humming praises, unaware they've been witness to an unspeakable blueprint for silent torture. In a lecture hall painted in dim gaslight, Herbert Mallory stood before rows of eager faces, his tall frame draped in a black frock coat that swallowed the pale glow of lanterns lining the walls. And he spoke of misery not as a curse, but as a key to unlocking genius, his reputation lending unsettling gravity to every measured syllable. His words drifted through the crowded room like smoke, curling around carved oak seats worn smooth by decades of hopeful students, and he invited his audience to imagine suffering refined by science, a slow flame that could be contained and directed toward brilliance. He began by recounting Francis Galton's studies of eminent families, tracing a lineage where hardship and triumph were intertwined, and argued that pain, like metal in a forge, could be tempered into brilliance if guided by the steady hand of medical authority. Every head in the hall inclined forward, every pen poised to capture his premise that controlled misery might one day chart a new course for human evolution. He paused and allowed silence to settle on the hall like a living thing, then signaled an assistant to dim the gaslights until only 2 lanterns cast long shadows at the room's edges. A hush deepened into something near reverence, and Mallory's voice rose again, calm and unhurried, describing the mechanics of his quiet method and the hermetic rite, practices he claimed merged the best of sensory deprivation and symbolic ritual. He spoke of cloaked hoods fashioned from moth-wing silk, of powdered nightshade applied in arcane patterns to bare flesh, of water baptisms spiked with laudanum that ushered willing subjects into visions of past lives, all in service of mapping the architecture of the soul. As he painted this vision, his audience sat enthralled, imagining a future where the mind's hidden chambers lay open to exploration, and every whisper of fear could be measured and catalogued. Then, with deliberate calm, Mallory invited a volunteer from the front row. A young man clad in a threadbare suit rose, eyes bright with ambition and trust, and stepped forward to the small stage. Mallory praised his courage before presenting a narrow hood stitched with silver sigils and outlined in the faintest dust of nightshade. In the lantern glow, the hood seemed to pulse with promise, as if alive. Mallory guided the student's head into the silken chamber, fastening it securely beneath his chin, and instructed him to sit upon a bench. The student obeyed with a slow reverence, pressing his palms to his knees, his gaze steady behind shut lids. Mallory told the audience to observe what happened when misery became voluntary, when fear was a path laid by science rather than an accident of fate. Moments drifted by with no sound but the student's shallow breathing. Then a single thud echoed as he slumped forward, the hood slipping loose to reveal a face drained of color, eyes dark with panic. He lurched to his feet, pressing trembling hands against phantom walls, as though the stage had become a void from which he could not escape. Mallory moved like a shadow to catch him, speaking soft words of assurance while commanding the lights to be restored. When the lanterns flared back to brightness, the student's body quivered and a hush of dismay rippled through the hall. Though no one dared murmur aloud, Mallory's expression remained composed as he pronounced the demonstration a success, insisting that the student had glimpsed the raw nerve of consciousness itself and seen what lay beyond the veneer of normalcy. He praised the subject's fortitude and argued that such trials would, with refinement, yield a harvest of new discoveries. As he concluded, Mallory invited applause, and the hall responded with a swell of admiration, voices humming with excitement as they rose to their feet. They spoke among themselves of the potential medical breakthroughs, unaware that their applause had echoed through a chamber of unleashed terror. They dismissed the student's hollow gaze as momentary shock and praised Mallory's brilliance in standing before them unswayed. No one noticed the faint smear of moth-wing dust glimmering on the stage floor, nor the single silk hood abandoned at the edge of the dais, its sigils still faintly glowing as though remembering the student's final heartbeat. After the lecture, Mallory lingered alone, his hand brushing the cold wood of the podium as he reflected on the demonstration. He retraced the sigils on the stage hood with a fingertip, feeling the rough edges carved into the silk, and imagined the student's mind fractured into silent shards of fear. In the narrow corridor outside, he heard muffled footsteps and the distant drip of water, reminders of cellars where real experiments awaited. He slipped the hood into a leather satchel and vanished into the back stairwell, leaving the lecture hall bathed in residual tension. The audience departed into the night, voices light with optimism, never suspecting they had been witnesses to an unspeakable blueprint for silent torture. An opening act in a symphony of cruelty Mallory intended to conduct from the shadows. In a candlelit vault, Mallory baptizes his victims with communion wafers laced with arsenic and powdered bone fragments, chanting psalms reversed from medieval manuscripts. Each wafer seals a pact. The victim's mind will fracture, and Mallory will record every splinter of their despair. Beneath the stone arches of the Institute's hidden vault, Herbert Mallory arranged a makeshift altar of rough-hewn oak, its surface stained faintly with old blood that glimmered in the flickering light of 13 candles lined on wrought iron sconces. He stood before the altar in his black frock coat, face composed but eyes reflecting the lantern flame as though containing secret fires. Around him the walls were carved with arcane symbols, runes drawn from the Book of the Devil's Mass discovered in a burned monastery outside Dijon. and Mallory traced their lines with a gloved finger before beginning the ceremony. His assistant, a gaunt youth with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, approached with a silver platter bearing a stack of communion wafers so pristine they looked like thin ivory discs. Mallory dipped each wafer in a vial of crushed arsenic amalgam and powdered human bone, the fragments gifted by a local apothecary who believed Mallory's experiments would advance medical knowledge. The bone dust came from unmarked graves of executed felons, ground to a chalky consistency and mixed with the arsenic to form a paste that clung to the wafers like sin itself. As Mallory lifted the first wafer, he spoke a line of psalmody reversed, words once holy now twisted into an invocation of despair, drawn from medieval manuscripts that condemn the righteous to suffer for their arrogance. His tone was gentle but unwavering. Mors et tenebrae hostis erit animae tuae, he intoned, and the words slithered through the vault like a serpent's hiss. With care, he placed the wafer on the trembling lips of his subject, a young woman brought for a diagnosis of hysteria. She closed her eyes in solemn acceptance, trusting the ritual as she would a sacrament, unaware that each wafer was a silent weapon undoing her mind. The arsenic bit at her tongue, a slow poison that numbed her senses even as it burned her throat, while the bone fragments dug into her conscience like splinters, awakening primal guilt buried beneath her memories. Mallory watched the moment her face drained of color, how her breath turned ragged as the toxins mingled with ceremony, fracturing her grip on reality. He recorded every moment in his ledger with clinical precision. The exact milligram of arsenic per wafer, the pulsing rhythm of her pulse as measured by his stethoscope pressed to her wrist, the tremor in her hand as she licked the last crumb from her lips. Over the next hour, Mallory advanced through 7 more wafers, each placed with deliberate solemnity and sealed with another reversed psalm. He paused between wafers to observe his subject's shifting gaze, noting how her eyes flickered with hallucinations. Visions of cloaks dripping in blood, of silent monks chanting in empty cathedrals, of corridors that twisted into the shape of skulls. Each vision he logged as evidence that the mixture of poison and bone, rhythm and word tore open the psyche's hidden chambers. When the final wafer was consumed, the subject fell to her knees, arms outstretched in a wordless plea, her mind cleaved in two by the corrosive ritual. Mallory leaned close and murmured, "Your past lives beckon you home," then retreated to the shadows to let the aftermath unfold. The candles danced in the vault's corners, and for a moment the silence was absolute, as though the world beyond had ceased to exist. Then the subject's cry rang out, a sound unformed by language, raw and ragged, carrying centuries of suffering in a single syllable. Mallory noted its pitch and duration, compared later to his collection of prior recordings to chart the trajectory of despair across different minds. By dawn, the subject lay on the altar like a broken statue, tears tracking through the arsenic's film on her cheeks. Mallory sprinkled lavender oil over her temples to dull the residual pain, then gently raised her head and pressed a finger to her lips. He whispered that he would release her soon, that her ordeal served a grander purpose, but she could not meet his gaze. Her eyes reflected only the chasm where her soul once rested. He descended to his ledger again, inscribing, "Subject achieved transcendence of self, witnessed echoes of past lives, fragments recorded for future study." He closed the book with a soft thud and set it aside. When Mallory returned above to the chemistry wing, he carried with him a single candle stub salvaged from the vault. The wax melted into twisted shapes like bones and locked it away in the oak box beneath the dais where each stub memorialized a mind undone. In his lecture halls, he spoke of new frontiers in psychological treatment, of the need to embrace controlled suffering as the crucible of progress, and his colleagues nodded in admiration, unaware that their applause masked complicity in a ritual far darker than any academic pursuit. The vault door remained sealed behind him, its lock unremarkable yet impenetrable, guarding the ceremony's remnants until the next communion of poison and bone could commence. And in the hush of the Institute's corridors, the echo of that unholy cry lingered, a silent testament to Mallory's conviction that true knowledge lay not in comfort, but in the fracturing of the human mind. When bodies begin returning to Ellesmere Church, limp, drained of blood, organs missing, Dr. Emily Clark, niece of Florence Nightingale, senses a pattern. Following broken bones and scorched initials carved on ribs, she realizes the Institute's patients never truly died, but were reborn into Mallory's grim ledger. Dr. Emily Clark arrived at Ellesmere Church just before dawn, her steps muffled by dew-soaked grass as she approached the ancient stone walls, where flickering lanterns cast long shadows across weathered gargoyles. She carried a leather satchel heavy with medical tools and her uncle's stern lessons on observation and compassion. And as she stepped inside, the scent of incense mingled with something coppery and wrong. The first body lay on a bier near the altar, its limbs folded awkwardly, the skin drained to the pale tone of a dying moon. Emily knelt beside it, her gloved hand lifting its wrist. No pulse, no warmth, and yet decisive signs of deliberate bloodletting where the veins had been expertly severed. She pressed her palm to the rib cage and felt nothing but hollow cold, but when she turned the corpse over, her breath caught at the initials scorched into bone so precise they looked branded by hot iron. A broken femur splintered like rotten wood just above the knee, as though someone had applied force in a calculated arc. Emily's heart pounded not with fear, but the grim excitement of a detective certain she stood on a clue. She moved down the row of pews and discovered another body, its arms stretched as if crucified, wrists bent at unnatural angles. The collarbone fractured cleanly on both sides. Beneath its left scapula, a circle of initials burned into flesh and bone formed a cipher she recognized from Mallory's notebooks. The same pattern he had used in his rite of nightshade. Emily recalled the ledger's coded entries on subjects who vanished from the Institute's cellars, and she realized with mounting dread that those deaths had been engineered facades. Mallory's victims had been subjects, not corpses, reborn into his experiments, then returned in hollow shells to Ellesmere Church as gruesome warnings or inscrutable signatures. She steadied herself against a wooden pew, listening to the echo of dripping water from some hidden source, and recalled rumors of distant wails in the hospital wing. Reports dismissed by Dr. Hildebrand as delirium or simple grief. But Emily knew better. She had seen the Institute's hidden doors, traced its secret tunnels, and studied Mallory's careful scripts on ritual and anatomy. His notebook spoke of fracturing souls like glass to reveal hidden chambers, then reassembling them with scar tissue and ritual symbols. Here in the church, that process lay bare in each broken bone and branded glyph, marking bodies that had once been living proof of Mallory's experiments. She knelt beside a third corpse, its jaw hanging slack and a jagged gash across its throat that curdled her stomach. Yet she catalogued every detail. The blackened edges of the cut, the angle suggesting a thrust from below rather than a downward slice, the way the muscles around the neck had been cauterized with a heated blade. A single candle stub lay at its feet, its wax wicked down one side, an unspoken tally of lives returned. The initials on its ribs were new, an overlapping pattern of hooks and spirals that Emily had seen only in Mallory's margins next to the phrase "rebirth through silence." She photographed the scene with a shaky hand, then replaced the camera in her satchel, determined to confront the Institute's director with evidence no polite society could ignore. But when she rose, she felt the church's hush press in around her. The silence so total it blanketed her ears and scraped at her mind. The candle flames flickered, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw shapes moving in the corners, shadows coalescing into forms that vanished when she blinked. She touched the initials on the nearest rib with a gloved fingertip, feeling the slight ridge where flame had singed flesh to bone, and wondered what whispered horrors those scars held in memory. Each corpse was a message from Mallory, a summation of his work. Bodies emptied, minds remade, souls marked with symbols no one alive could decipher. Determined, Emily set off toward the Institute's chemistry wing, the path she had mapped days before in case of exactly this discovery. She passed beneath archways where the stained glass cast fractured colors on the floor, reds and purples like pooling blood, her boot heels clicking against stone as she approached the door she knew to be unguarded after midnight. Inside, the corridors lay silent except for the hum of the water pipes and the faint hiss of gases used in laboratory lamps. She pressed her ear to the wood paneling and heard the faint drip of a sink somewhere ahead, then slipped inside the hidden stairwell that led down to Mallory's vaults. With each step, the air grew colder, and Emily felt her pulse hammer in her temples. She emerged into the vaulted cellar where the walls bore the chalked outlines of bones and ritual glyphs, and in the center stood Mallory's oak box, its lid cracked open to reveal a line of candle stubs arranged like grave markers. She knelt before it, counting each stub alongside the name scrawled in Mallory's precise handwriting on folded parchments. Names of students, patients, lab assistants, each vanished into the quiet method or the rite of nightshade and returned only as husks destined for Ellesmere Church. Emily lifted one stub, its wax cool against her palm, and realized that Mallory had authored a catalog of rebirth and death so methodical that he alone held the power to name who lived, who died, and who would return marked by his hand. A cough echoed from the stairwell, and Emily snapped the box closed, tucking the stub into her coat pocket alongside her camera. Her breath came in shallow gusts as she followed the corridor back toward the hidden door, determination burning in her chest. She would confront Mallory with the ledger and the stubs and force him to answer for the living corpses he had created. In the hush of the Institute, each footstep felt like a stroke on a ledger of her own making, the tally of a woman who would not let the echoes of the gone remain silent. In the days after Dr. Emily Clark presented her evidence of returning bodies at Ellesmere Church, The town council's secret minutes emerged like a plague on respectable society, scattering any pretense of innocence. Emily studied the brittle pages beneath flickering lamplight, her gloved finger tracing each signature that bound local leaders to Herbert Mallory's gruesome experiments. Edmund Barnes's elegant script lay next to names of Alderman Blackwood, Haversham, and Thornton, all pledging funds for the Institute's research wing, their ink forging a silent pact of prestige over morality. That realization crashed into Ellesmere's brittle calm on the night of the annual charity gala held in the Barnes courtyard, an event designed to celebrate benevolence and draw donors to the Institute. Bold white tents framed the fountain at the yard's center, and lanterns hung like captive stars across the lawn, their light soft enough to hide the rippling anxieties beneath polite conversation. Edmund Barnes, resplendent in a tailored coat, delivered a speech praising compassion and research. His voice smooth like aged wine and his words warmed by the promise of progress. He gestured toward the shadows beyond the lantern glow and spoke of curing despair through science, unaware that his own complicity mirrored the darkness he claimed to eradicate. As Edmund raised a toast to the future, a sudden scream shattered the evening. Glassware fell from trembling hands and clattered across marble as guests turned toward the fountain where Mary Barnes had vanished. In her place lay a single white slipper, its partner nowhere in sight, and a smear of crimson staining the carved stone. Panic coursed through the crowd, voices rising in fear as lantern lights swept over upturned faces. Some pressed hands to throats in stunned silence, others scattered behind overturned tables, their gowns and coats snagged on tent poles. Emily forced her way through the press, lantern beam guiding her to where Mary's slipper glowed under fractured light. She knelt and detected the faint scent of nightshade along the rim, a cruel echo of Mallory's cellar rituals. Her fingers brushed a carved symbol etched into the stone, the same twisted glyph she had seen in Mallory's journals. A thread of realization tightened in her chest. The gala itself had been the stage for another of Mallory's performances. She looked up at Edmund Barnes, whose forced calm cracked into horror as he surveyed the scene he had unwittingly hosted. Footsteps echoed behind Emily. Some guests fled toward the street, others recoiled against tent ropes, and Emily, lantern raised, led a handful of men and women toward the hidden gate she had memorized. The iron barrier gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow passage to the Institute's lower wing. They descended stone steps slick with condensation, heartbeats drumming louder with each step. At the bottom, Emily pushed open a door to Mallory's cellar, its hinges protesting as lamplight spilled into a world of dripping walls and ominous silence. Mary's cries cut through the hush. She lay strapped to the stone dais, eyes wide with panic, limbs trembling as Mallory stood nearby, calm as though surveying a rare specimen. His hands were stained dark from powdered nightshade, and his eyes glinted with admiration as he watched Mary's struggle. Edmund Barnes reached the dais and knelt beside his daughter, tears pooling in his eyes as he murmured apologies she could not hear above the pounding of her own fear. He pleaded silently as Mary's screams rattled the vaulted ceiling. Yet Mallory made no move to halt the ritual until it served his purpose. Mallory spoke then, his voice soft and even, telling the assembled that Mary had volunteered for the final demonstration. a proof that the human mind's boundaries could be redrawn by pain and ritual. He described the rite of nightshade and the quiet method as breakthroughs destined to redefine science. His words dripping with ritual authority, yet none could ignore the cruelty they justified. Emily moved to free Mary, her hands working at the straps while Edmund watched, his face a mask of anguish. When Mary collapsed into Emily's arms, Mallory clapped softly, praising the courage of his subjects and the vision of his patrons. His apology to the Barnes family was an empty gesture, his true devotion lying in the methodical breaking and remaking of minds. Edmund turned on Mallory with bitter reproach, accusing him of betrayal, but Mallory offered only a bowed head and a single phrase: "True progress demands sacrifice." In that moment, the fragile unity of honorable men collapsed into shards of horror, their trust splintered by the revelation of their own complicity. They emerged into the courtyard at dawn's edge, where lanterns burned low and dew glimmered on tent fabric like tears. Mary, pale and trembling, was carried into arms that once held confidence and prestige, now stained by collusion. Council members stood in mute judgment, their signatures binding them no longer to the promise of science, but to a history of atrocities. Ellesmere would never forget that night when power bowed before horror forever, and innocence was lost. In the gray dawn following the last night of horror, the Barnes Institute stood silent beneath a sky bruised by lingering dread. Its grand doors rigidly nailed shut with thick oak planks and iron spikes, sealing its wounds for a century beneath layers of dust and rumor. Townspeople gathered near an ash tree at the edge of the Institute grounds where a simple memorial stone had been erected, a slab of local sandstone carved only with names and dates, devoid of flourish or explanation, as though shame itself demanded the austere anonymity of the dead. Dr. Emily Clark stood before the stone, her shoulders heavy with the weight of truth, her eyes tracing the names of those who never truly died but were returned as empty vessels in Herbert Mallory's unholy ledger. Beneath the ash tree's skeletal branches, she remembered the hurried council meetings, the bitter arguments flickering between morality and prestige, and how each signature in those minutes had bound the powerful to complicity. Scholars and clerics debated in hushed tones whether laws on medical oversight should be rewritten, arguing in lecture halls and journals that the boundary between curiosity and cruelty must be policed by unbreakable statutes. Newspapers churned out editorials demanding accountability, their ink smeared occasionally by tears of families seeking closure that promised only bitter questions. In lecture theaters at the Royal College, professors argued that the quiet method and the rite of nightshade had shown the world how science could veil monstrosity in the guise of progress, and that no hospital or institute must ever again hold secrets behind locked doors and midnight rituals. Children in Ellesmere learned of Mallory's crimes in history lessons that spoke of heroes and villains, their voices soft with shock as they realized true evil might wear the mask of normalcy, of benevolence. Meanwhile, whispers echoed through corridors of power, rumors that some of Mallory's notebooks had vanished before the sealing of records, spirited away by unknown hands who feared their own names might appear in the ledger of horror. Beneath the ash tree, Emily placed a single white rose at the base of the memorial stone, its petals fragile against the etched names, and wondered whether memory alone could guard against the repetition of those atrocities. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, and she felt in that moment an echo of candle flames that once danced in vaulted cellars, an echo of chanting voices that twisted holy words into spells, an echo of hoods drawn tight to muffle sight and sound until only terror remained. She turned away from the stone and looked back at the institute, its windows blank as empty eyes, its silent form a reminder that walls could hold both knowledge and nightmare. In the years that followed, petitions circulated calling for the stones of the institute to be removed entirely, replaced by gardens or memorial parks. But Emily fought for the stone beneath the ash, insisting that this place, scarred by deliberate cruelty, must remain marked by stern reminder. Let the earth remember that evil was not a force of nature but a choice made by minds cloaked in civility, she argued, and that remembrance was the only promise of vigilance. Opinions clashed. Some said that closing the institute and burying its records would bury the victims a second time, that sunlight should shine into every hidden corridor. Others countered that opening long-sealed documents risked inspiring a new generation of seekers drawn to Mallory's arcane methods. Debate raged in salons and societies, but the memorial stone endured, its blank surface betraying nothing and yet speaking volumes to those who paused in silence. Tourists visited with quiet reverence, photographs capturing mothers shielding children's eyes, elderly survivors tracing lines in the sandstone with trembling fingers as though hoping to summon back lost voices. In the hush of evening, when the ash tree's silhouette grew black against the sky, Emily heard in her mind the faint drip of water in underground vaults and the echo of hoods lowered over terrified heads, and she pressed a hand to her temple, as if warding off memories that insisted on returning in full force. She had studied the psychology of madness, but nothing had prepared her for the study of human evil conducted by a man who wore kindness like a cloak. In the quiet of her home, she kept a journal of reflections, writing that evil does not announce itself with horns or fangs, but whispers in the soft voice of normalcy, that it thrives in halls of learning when curiosity strays into control, and that vigilance must be the inheritor of compassion. She ended each entry with a question scrawled in red ink. What do you think? Could this happen again? That question, she knew, was the true legacy of the Barnes Institute. It slipped into conversation at dinner tables and dawn vigils, a challenge to every generation to answer not with laws alone, but with moral courage. Under the ash tree, seasons turned, blossoms in spring, leaves in summer, gold in autumn, bare boughs in winter, and the memorial stone watched over them all, a sentinel of remembrance in an ever-changing world. And somewhere in the hush of Ellesmere's night, a single lantern burned in a room where Mallory's sealed records lay hidden, waiting for a hand brave or foolish enough to open them. For in those pages the blueprint for silent torture remained intact, a testament to the fragile veneer of normalcy that guards the face of true evil, and to the enduring question that Emily Clark posed with every line of her journal, echoing across time like a warning and an invitation. What do you think? Could this happen again?